Good afternoon, everyone. The Office of the Vice President of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion welcomes you to the inaugural Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Decolonization Week, Day 5. My name is Caitlin Ellsworth, and I'm the Black Student Support Coordinator here at the University of Windsor. We welcome you, and we are here to celebrate and honor our diversified community by featuring a variety of events each day. The first event was Monday, March 21st, and the last event is tomorrow, Saturday, March 26th. Tomorrow's event from 9:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a virtual symposium on the book A Fluid Frontier, Slavery, Resistance, the Underground Railroad, and the Detroit River Region will be taking place. Speakers are Carolyn Smart-Frost, contributors Kimberly Simmons, Roy Finkenbein, Carol Mull, and Irene Moore Davis, student researchers Carly Kokiak and Willow Key, and special guests are Carol Mull and Adrian Shad. This is in partnership with the Essex County Black Historical Research Society. To register for the event, visit uwindsor.ca.bpedi. I would now like to give an acknowledgement of the land. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Windsor is built on land that is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. I acknowledge and thank the traditional custodians of the land for their wisdom and connection to this place. We invite you into a tradition with us of acknowledging and remembering whose territory you are on wherever you are. I would also like to enter into a tradition of acknowledging the land through an Afrocentric lens. As people of African descent, we offer this land recognition in solidarity with the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island in the effort and deliberate intentions toward decolonization. We acknowledge the land of Turtle Island that was never meant to be owned. We recognize that most of the land that was entrusted to the indigenous peoples was in some cases shared by choice, but all too often taken by force. We recognize the historical colonialism and the ongoing colonialism that has led to the present day situation where land acknowledgements are offered in place of land. As people of African descent, many of us have come here by choice, while many are here as a result of historical force. We acknowledge the complexities where we were promised land that was never given by those whose it was never to give. As people of African descent, we acknowledge the land of Turtle Island that sustains us, express deep gratitude to its indigenous peoples, and pledge to honor our dignity and divinity that ultimately connects us all, Ashe. And many thanks to Kay Johnson for that Afrocentric land acknowledgement. I would now like to introduce Dr. Clinton Beckford, Vice President, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion at the University of Windsor, who will now be the moderator for today's event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Isaac Sani this evening, and I'm going to introduce him in a moment. But just to just give you a little insight about how we will proceed this afternoon. The question and answer section is going to be open throughout, feature is going to be open throughout the conversation this evening. So please, as you go through this, as Dr. Sani presents, please note your questions in the question and answer feature. And at the end of his talk, I'm going to try and get through as many of these of your questions as possible. You know, Malcolm X used to say, "Make it plain." You know, whenever he was about to speak, and you know, people were always anxious to give a long introduction of him, and you know, he would say, "Make it plain, make it plain." And Dr. Sani is a little bit like that. You know, he didn't send us a long biography at all, because you know, he wanted to talk to you. So I'm going to respect that. And I just wanted to introduce him to you very briefly. Dr. Sani is a member of the faculty of Dalhousie University's College of Continuing Education. He's also an adjunct professor of international development studies at St. Mary's University in Halifax. His research interests are Cuba, international political economy, race and racism, and Black Nova Scotian history. And he lectures and publishes regularly and prolifically in these fields. He has lectured and taught courses on Cuba, Caribbean political economy, law and human rights, and African Canadian history. He's also written extensively on a wide variety of topics for various journals and magazines. And I know that he was recently working on a book project as well. Utilizing several university courses, he is the author of the highly regarded book, Cuba, A Revolution in Motion. And he's presented in many, many cities across North America, but also works internationally and has done a lot of work in the Caribbean. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Sani, who is going to be talking to us this evening on his topic, Remembrance, Revelation, and Reparation, the Transatlantic Slave System and its Afterlife. Welcome, Dr. Sani. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. It is a great pleasure to be speaking today during this week focused on decolonization. I'm speaking to you from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Ketchipochik in the Mi'kmaq language. It is the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. But Nova Scotia is also home to over 250 years of history of people of African descent. There's a long-standing community of African descended people here, who have not only, through many trials and tribulations, have not only built resilient communities, but also have built very strong connections with the Mi'kmaq Nation. In fact, there's been a tremendous amount of, shall we say, intermarriage between both communities. So I bring you welcome from Halifax, Nova Scotia. I want to thank Dr. Beckford and his Office of Equity and Inclusion for inviting me to speak today about a topic that I think is critically important and to which I'm passionate about. And I want to thank Caitlin, Ms. Ellsworth, for basically all the work she's put in, and the other support staff who have been so incredibly helpful. The topic which I'm speaking about today, which is the transatlantic slave system and its afterlife, Remembrance, Revelation, and Reparation, is sort of an apt topic given the recent events, the protest, the visit of Prince William and Princess Kate, members of the British royal family, to Jamaica. As not only people have protested their visit, but more importantly have drawn the connection perhaps between the Caribbean's many economic travails, economic woes, what people often refer to in economics as its economic underdevelopment, and the whole history of the transatlantic slave trade, its exploitation and colonialism. And as Jamaica moves towards republic status as Barbados, it's not just simply in many cases a symbolic or nominal gesture. It's really an attempt to recognize that not only that the past that has happened needs to be redressed and account needs to be rendered, but as I have in my quote here, the past is never dead, it's not even past. There is an afterlife to this. And it's important to understand in many ways that the experience of people of African descent, those of us who are of African descent, who live in the Americas, our very lives today in 2022 are in very profound ways shaped by the processes, the dynamics, the constellation of values and worldviews that emanated from the transatlantic slave trade. I'd like to begin perhaps with a story from a Canadian context. When we think of the transatlantic slave trade, when we think of slavery, we often think of it as something outside of the bounds of Canadian history. Perhaps in the question and answer, we can address what is considered to be part of Canadian history. It's interesting that the War of 1812 is considered to be a seminal part of Canadian history, yet slavery itself is sometimes seen not to be part of Canadian history, because the argument is often made that Canada did not officially, or at least this political arrangements that now constitute Canada, did not come into being until July the 1st, 1867, and slavery came to an end in the British Empire in 1834, and in Canada, thus before 1867, and therefore really can't be part of Canadian history. Yet the War of 1812 is. So we have this curious political, perhaps double standard or contradiction in what is considered to be part of Canadian history and what is not part of Canadian history, and therefore in many cases what are the obligations, responsibilities, and the liabilities of the Canadian state. On the image slide here, we have images of these, shall we say, sale ads for enslaved Africans, for African humanity, that are taken from Canadian history. These are not US ads. The shackles that you see are from Canada. In fact, one of them is from Nova Scotia, one of them is from New Brunswick. The collar is not meant to identify the name of this particular enslaved African, but who their quote-unquote particular owner is. You may also see a picture of Matthew da Costa. There was a stamp that was issued for Matthew da Costa as the first historical record of someone of African descent appearing in what was to become the Canada, or at least at the time was the Canadas, or what was the British and French territories at that time as these territories began to be colonized by these various European powers. And Matthew da Costa is really an anomaly because he appears as a free individual. But this despite the fact that the vast majority of people of African descent in the Americas and in what is North America and what was to become Canada would be in a state of enslavement. And so Matthew da Costa represents a very interesting story in terms of somebody who was able, through his interpreting skills and other skills and expertise that he had, to carve out a certain space for himself within the colonial project. But his appearance in the historical record is one that stands in stark contrast to the overwhelming condition of people of African descent in the Americas and in what was to become the Canadas. The first known enslaved African to live in Canada that we know of was a 6-year-old boy who was brought here. We know he was a property of Sir David Kirky, who was from Britain. We know he was sold several times, and at the end of this record of transactions, he ends up being part of the property of Father Paul Lejeune, who was a Roman Catholic priest in what is to become Quebec. He was 6 years old at the time, as I said, and in 1632, 1633, so it's 1628, we have his record of him. In 1632, 1633, he is baptized. Father Lejeune baptizes him under the Code Noir, which was this body of specific law promulgated by France at the time, the French Empire. It regulated the enslavement of people of African descent. And under the Code Noir, Africans could be baptized. So Father Paul Lejeune baptizes the 10-year-old Olivier Lejeune. When Olivier Lejeune asks him what is the point of baptism, Father Paul Lejeune recounts the story that he said, "So you can be like me. All men are one, united in Christianity," quote unquote. In response to the fact that he will be united and made the same as Father Lejeune by being baptized, the 10-year-old Olivier replies, quote, "You say that baptism, I shall be like you. I am black and you are white. I must have my skin taken off then in order to be like you." In his recounting of the story, Father Lejeune ridicules the 10-year-old's statement and retort, basically presenting it as the incomprehensible gibberish of a 10-year-old, and as of an African, you can't understand the profound metaphorical meaning behind baptism. However, another reading of that is an understanding, and a very clear understanding and political statement by the 10-year-old Olivier Lejeune, that he is basically underscoring the profound political, economic, and social inequality that exists between the European and the enslaved African. He, in many cases, is analyzing and diagnosing, okay, what is to be the color line in Canada. That people of African descent are always going to find their citizen incredibly problematic and going to be in a position of marginalization and disenfranchisement. So in many ways, when we think about Black political thought, when we think about Black intellectual resistance, perhaps we can say the first recorded instance is from this 10-year-old boy in 1632, 1633, who so clearly, poignantly, and succinctly encapsulates the profound hypocrisy that exists, where one side claims to be presenting unity, freedom, and equality, while the absolute reality and practice is to the opposite. So I wanted to begin with that powerful story, one that connects Canada, not as simply an observer to the transatlantic slave system and the consequences, but as a direct beneficiary and a participant in the transatlantic slave trade. The research of Canada's connections in slavery and into the transatlantic slave system is in its infancy. I noticed that in the introduction that, for example, Carolyn Smart-Frost will be presenting tomorrow. She's one of the leading researchers on this topic in Canada and has written extensively on it. In the new collection called Unsettling the Great White North, Black Canadian History, a new collection of musings on Black Canadian history. She has quite a powerful contribution in that, which appears very early on. So slavery and the research of Canada's links to slavery and the transatlantic slave trade is in its infancy. And quite often when I do lectures, I teach Introduction to African Canadian Studies and also African Nova Scotian History here at Dalhousie University. Quite often when I begin a discussion of the Black interaction in Canada with and involvement with what was to become Canada with slavery, people are quite stunned at the number of slave ads and auctions for slaves and advertisements for Africans who are being sold. They're stunned at the number of ads I can reproduce. And yet this study is still in its infancy. So I wanted to draw that connection and also to pay homage to the 10-year-old Olivier Lejeune, who, in a sense, who I have pointed out, really is the first engagement of what it means to be Black in Canada and to actually look at the condition of actually Blackness in the Canadian context. And very early on, as I said, he provides us very succinct, clear, and powerful analysis. As I make this presentation, and as we are involved in this week of decolonization, and as we go beyond, it's important to note that we are in the midst of the International Decade for People of African Descent, often referred to by its acronym IDPAD. This was the decade was proclaimed to last from 2015 to 2024 by the United Nations General Assembly on December 23, 2013. The decade builds on and amplifies previous UN initiatives regarding slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. For example, on December 17, 2007, the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed March 25th, which is today, as the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Central to the International Decade for the People of African Descent is a recognition of the ongoing legacy and impact of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and colonialism. Direct provenance lies with the historic 2001 United Nations World Conference on Racism, which declared, and I quote, that slavery and the slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade, were appalling tragedies in the history of humanity. That slavery and the slave trade are a crime against humanity and should always have been so, especially the transatlantic slave trade, and are among the major sources and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And that Africans and people of African descent were victims of these acts and continue to be victims of their consequences. End of quote. It's important to note as an aside that when this conference took place in 2001, late August and early September, it was a major international event, an event in which debates over questions such as reparations for slavery and colonialism dominated the discussions and the discourse. And it was front page news. And when the West was isolated and defeated on these issues, it was seen as a major defeat for the West and a major victory, not only for this global South, but for those countries of the Caribbean and Latin America and for countries of Africa that had suffered the depredations of European colonialism. However, this conference has been forgotten. And we all know why, because shortly after the conference came to an end in Durban, South Africa, in early September of 2001, the events of 9/11 2001 happened and transformed geopolitics. much as some people believe geopolitics are now being transformed by recent events. And this conference was forgotten, and its significance and impact was erased. But yet it still looms very large as a source for many of the ideas that people generated around the International Decade for People of African Descent. The November 18, 2014 United Nations Program of Activities for the Implementation of the International Decade for Peoples of African Descent echoed the ideas of the position that slavery was central to actually not only having created the conditions in which people of African descent, both on the continent of Africa and in the Americas and elsewhere, live, but also in shaping the world that we live in today for the majority of humanity. It echoed the stance by stating, quote, that people of African descent were the victims of slavery, the slave trade and colonialism, and continue to be victims of their consequences, end of quote. Scholars have discussed and debated the relationship between the transatlantic slave trade and the modern world, especially the emergence and consolidation of the international economic system that we live in, often referred to as capitalism, and the intersections and articulations between racism and the current international economic order, obviously racism and capitalism. The scholar Trevor Goetz argues that it's more accurate to speak of the transatlantic slave system rather than the conventional transatlantic slave trade. While the centrality of the transatlantic slave trade as a reference framework is indisputable, the boundaries of slavery as an international institution, mode of production, and social practice exceeded the prosaic connotations of the commercial nexus. Goetz underscores the imperative, quote, to emphasize the systemic reach of the transatlantic slaving, which extended well beyond commerce, end of quote. And within the scope of the transatlantic slaving system, not just the transport of African humanity in the millions across the Atlantic Ocean, okay, and not just the plantation economy, as horrible as those two things were, but the fact that there was an international web and architecture that emerged based on it. And we have discovered, as we continue our research here in Canada, that there were people who may never have owned enslaved Africans, who were part of the Canadian elite, the ruling class, the ruling circles, but who were deeply financially implicated in investments in the transatlantic slave system. During the span of the transatlantic slave system, the Atlantic Ocean became the superhighway for the transfer of millions of kidnapped Africans. In fact, there are many debates over how many people actually were taken, and people have often argued they came, some of them from East Africa and up and down West and Central Africa, as you can see on the graph here. The accepted estimates are 12 to 15 million people at least. Harvard has collected a database of over 26,000 different voyages, okay, carrying manifest of people being brought across. We all know that there was a significant amount of the transatlantic slave trade that is not recorded, that was done clandestinely, and therefore the numbers are probably much greater than this 12 to 15 million. It also doesn't take into account those who died in crossing the Middle Passage and so forth as they went across the Atlantic Ocean. Some estimates presented as maybe 10 to 20% of the numbers of Africans who were landed alive in the shores actually died in the crossing. And of course, many people are familiar with how Africans were stacked in order to be brought across the Atlantic. In fact, there used to be a huge debate over what was the most efficacious and effective means by which to do it. Some of the people involved in slaving ships, and we know there were actually slaving ships that were built here in Halifax, argue that perhaps they should try and keep as many Africans alive as possible, while others argue no, pack Africans in as much as possible, right? In a sense that that enough would survive, that a tremendous profit could still be made. In fact, there are reports, for example, of when enough provisions was not provided. There's a famous case of the Zog. There's a famous case of the Amistad case. People may remember of that, when a Portuguese ship was actually brought across, the Tecondra, brought across the Atlantic Ocean, and they didn't have enough provisions to feed the Africans, and so they made a decision to throw many overboard and so on. And so this represents here here, people may see this, this was part of the abolition movement, how people stack people in as much as possible, because the argument was many would die, but enough would survive that one would make a profit from it, and so on. They even had ideas, for example, of how to stack them. This is the coffin position. So the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade are very well documented, but often ignored. So as I said, during the span of the transatlantic slave trade, the Atlantic Ocean became the superhighway for the transfer of millions of kidnapped Africans. Those who survived built new cultures and a new world, okay, in quotes, creating new built wealth for Europe and European-derived nations. Western wealth and power anchored in a racialized labor force. These historical processes were therefore the precursors and foundation of today's global distribution of wealth and power. The acknowledgement is at the core of the International Decade for the People of African Descent, which called on national governments to, quote, and I quote here, ensure that textbooks and other educational materials reflect historical facts accurately as they relate to past tragedies and atrocities, in particular slavery, the slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, given recognition to the victims and their descendants through the establishment of memorial sites in countries that I'm sorry, I lost my place here, my apologies. In countries that profited from and who were responsible for slavery. The slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, and colonialism are past tragedies where there is none. So these are very central issues. And in fact, there's a growing body of literature that points to the fact that we have various European institutions, various European families that have perhaps have dominated European life, both economically and politically, can trace their roots back into transatlantic slave trade. Barclays banks, for example, became rich and became viable by actually providing loans for enslaving voyages. Lloyd's of London's roots lie, for example, the insurance company, in insuring slaving ships. Slaving voyages were dangerous at that time. Why were they dangerous? Well, they were dangerous precisely because ships could sink in inclement weather. People could die of various diseases like scurvy and so forth. And of course, there was always the danger of your African cargo, right? Just humanity dying off in such great numbers, right? That you would lose money. And of course, one of the things I will address later on is African resistance on the ships to slavery itself as well. The role of slavery in building and not being exogenous, right, to the rise and consolidation of capitalism is, I think, an established fact. Okay, people debate the extent, perhaps, to which slavery funded the Industrial Revolution, but there's a growing literature that demonstrates that slavery itself was central to that. Even the young Karl Marx, if I may quote him, theorized that modern capitalism existed on the foundation of black slave labor. He said, quote, direct slavery is as much the pivot upon which our present-day industrialism turns as a machinery and credit. Without slavery, there would be no cotton. Without cotton, there would be no modern slavery. And so, in a sense, one of the things that scholars like Walter Rodney and John Blount have pointed out, J.M. Blount in his famous book, The Colonizer's Model of Development, Walter Rodney in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, was a central role in the wealth made from the plantations in funding the Industrial Revolution, providing the kind of dynamism and processes and economic architecture and that allowed things like ports to be like Bristol and Liverpool and so forth to develop in very significant ways, Nantes, for example, in France, but also the profits that were made from the slave trade, the raw materials that helped, in a sense, finance and drive the Industrial Revolution forward. We know this, okay? And of course, at the very foundation of transatlantic slavery is coerced black labor. Here you see one of the photos. Quite often I mention this when, for example, there was not enough provisions on board, when there was a danger that people could lose their profits because not enough Africans would survive because of the limited food. That's quite regularly demonstrated on the Zog, the case of the Zog, which I could probably go into a question, which was a case of insurance fraud. okay, that was perpetrated, went to courts on the basis of insurance fraud. There were frequent examples of Africans being thrown overboard in order to ensure the profitability of these slave missions, right? When people arrived in the Caribbean, the 12 to 15 million who arrived, there was an incredible brutality. Studies have shown that within 3 years, right, we had about 20%, to maybe a third of the Africans perishing, with very few surviving 10 years of the brutality of enslavement. In fact, Hilary Beckles, so Hilary Beckles, Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, premier scholar on slavery in the Caribbean, and a premier scholar on reparation, notes that from 1721 to 1834, over 600,000 enslaved Africans were brought into Barbados, just Barbados alone. And yet, in 1834, when slavery was abolished, the population of enslaved Africans was only 83,000. That speaks to the attrition rate and the brutality of the work rate and the mortality of enslaved Africans, right? They were expendable and the brutality was particularly intense. In lieu of time, I was going to quote extensively from Tony Martin's book on the Caribbean history. He spends a tremendous amount of time in his book providing a tour de force in the chapters called A Long Night of Enslavement, okay, in which he quotes from various official records, journals, for example, of various plantation owners documenting not only the brutality and the torture they inflicted, the reign of terror they inflicted on the enslaved Africans, but the depredations visited upon enslaved African women, right? It's a tour de force. I recommend it. And basically, he just simply draws on the journals of plantation writers. And it's truly terrifying when one looks at that. These are just simply some examples of the punishments that would be meted out to what were considered to be recalcitrant enslaved Africans who would be tortured. These are contemporary paintings from drawings from the time. The punishments that were quite horrific in terms of that. And as I mentioned, the attrition, I gave you the example. I gave you the example of Barbados. In Cuba, for example, in just one 10-year period from 1821 to 1831, 1 million enslaved Africans were imported into Cuba. And when one looks at the size of the Cuban African population, by the time slavery was abolished in Cuba in 1886, one is astonished at the attrition rate, the mortality rate, and so on. We can talk about this in greater detail later on. Now, when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, because of the domination of the United States in fixing that narrative, many people may have seen 12 Years as a Slave about Solomon Northup and the role of cotton. It's important to understand that at the heart of slavery was sugar. Over 70% of all enslaved Africans who landed in the Americas were involved in one way, directly or indirectly, into production of sugar. Sugar became white gold. It expanded from the template of sugar plantations in Brazil to become adopted all over the Caribbean. And as Eric Williams observed in his seminal work, Capitalism, Slavery, it was strange that an article like sugar, so sweet and necessary to human existence, should have occasioned such crimes and bloodshed. And so, for example, in this painting I have before you, drawn from that time, you see an overseer whipping an enslaved African, and in the back you also see whippings taking place, where the psychological wages of slavery are sort of indicated there, where Africans are forced to whip other Africans as well. And so there's a psychological consequence to this as well, not just the mortality rate, not just the oppression, not just the incredible trauma, but the psychological consequences of that. And so sugar itself, okay, becomes almost synonymous with the brutal exploitation of enslaved Africans, right? At the heart of the economy of slavery itself, at the heart of the wealth made by Western Europe, particularly from slavery itself, is what's often referred to as Atlantic Triangle. And from this graphic here, you can see what people often refer to as the Middle Passage. enslaved Africans are brought from Africa, and Walter Rodney documented how the institution of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and the many dimensions of the transatlantic slave system disrupted African development, particularly in West Africa, and laid bare and tore apart the social fabric. As Basil Davidson pointed out, everywhere that slavery touched in Africa, the social fabric of African society was torn apart as Africans were dragged in to the European world of misery. So we have Africans taken across in the Middle Passage. In the Americas, they're producing sugar and cotton and other products, which are then taken to various points and centers in Western Europe and so forth, fueling that economic development. And then you have, once again, cheap manufactured goods are then taken to Africa in that trade. What's not included in this diagram, of course, is the question of Canada. Okay, or what is to become the Canadas. There's also a trade that goes from the Atlantic coast of what is to become Canada to the Caribbean. Sugar and rum and molasses are sent up north to the Atlantic region in exchange for salted cod, and salted cod is used as a cheap and ready supply of protein to feed the enslaved African population. This is an area in which increasing research is being done, okay, to sort of to flesh out how Canada becomes part of this web, this intricate network of the transatlantic slave system through not only trade, but also, as I said, through financial investment and so on. As I said, people did not actually have to physically own enslaved Africans to be deeply implicated in the transatlantic slave system. One of the things I also want to address as well here, which I think is important, is that as we talk about the transatlantic slave trade itself, right, and we talk about the remembrance, right, and remembrance is about acknowledging the oppression. We do have, for example, memoirs of people such as Olade Equiano and other people, Booker T. Washington in the United States, Frederick Douglass, right? Okay, we can even see Mary Angelique, right? Who Dr. Fuwa Cooper wrote about so eloquently, right? Okay, in a testimony as a memoir in itself, right? As a slave, as somebody who survived slavery, writing a narrative, right? But for the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of the 12 to 15 million, they don't have a voice, right? And so remembrance is understanding the trauma that was inflicted for well over 300 years. If we look at the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade as beginning in the early 1500s, right, when we have the first records of Africans being brought across the transatlantic, and if we look at the abolition of slavery in Brazil, which was the last country in the Americas to formally abolish slavery in 1888. And I should actually put as an aside in parentheses, even though slavery in many of the Latin American countries is abolished, many of the plantation owners refused to pass that news on and actually follow the directive to abolish slavery. And so there are stories, for example, of Africans long after the abolition of slavery still working under the conditions of enslavement and the brutality and the dehumanization and the degradation of slavery, and only finding out when somebody brings that news to them, right? Such was the value of the enslaved Africans, not only to producing wealth, but sustaining a life of status and privilege and so on. So if we look at that, we're talking at nearly 400 years of enslavement of Africans, right? 400 years of a trauma. And so from 1888 to 2021, okay, that's 134 years if we add that up. So in fact, we have interviews with people who were former slaves taking place in the 1950s, 1960s, and so forth. In Cuba, there's a famous narrative, right, of a runaway slave done by Miguel Barnett, where he interviews Esteban Montejo, in the 1960s. In fact, Miguel Barnett's reputation as a major man of letters in Cuba was based on basically writing down and interpreting this narrative of Esteban Monteo. So in a sense, people are only a few generations removed from the trauma of enslavement and so on. And I will talk a bit about the consequences. But one of the things I want to also emphasize here, which is part of my publication, my work, is not simply to portray Africans as simply helpless, hapless victims in slavery itself, as victims, right? As people who lack agency, as merely people who are producing the wealth through coerced labor, right? But they're also resistors to this. When I gave my talk on the Haitian Revolution a couple of months ago, once again, I want to thank the University of Windsor and also Dr. Beckford for inviting me. One of the things I wanted to stress, okay, is the pervasive Eurocentric historiography that quite often writes Africans out of the story of the end of slavery, that portrays the abolition of the slave trade and slavery itself as the work simply of conscientious and dedicated white activists such as William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp. I don't want to underplay the role that white allies played in the struggle against slavery and against this horrific system. But I think it's important to understand that Africans were at the center of the struggle for their own liberation. And I think one of the things that Africans have done in the struggle against slavery, in this resistance, rebellion, and I would say in the case of the Haitian Revolution, obviously revolution, is the fact that they themselves are the agents and are the central actors in their own story of liberation. That is part of the revelation, right? Africans not only resisted slavery, but have challenged this racial hierarchy that Africans themselves are incapable of coming up with their own philosophical frameworks, their own conceptual frameworks for liberation and for how a society should be organized, i.e. they're incapable of political thought, even conceiving of the idea of freedom. I remember one time I was at a conference and somebody gave a paper on a rebellion in Barbados, right? And it was a rebellion of enslaved Africans. And in the course of his presentation, he says, well, I'm going to describe the rebellion for you, but I can't really talk about what motivated this rebellion. What were the sentiments and thinking behind it? Because Africans, really didn't have the conceptions of freedom that Europeans had, right? Actually, they could not conceive of freedom. I wish to challenge that notion, because one of the things that rebellions really demonstrated was that Africans were not only physically involved in rebelling against slavery, they were also intellectual authors trying to create a new world, right? So one of the things that slavery and the transatlantic slave system creates is not only a system of degradation, dehumanization, and oppression. In response to it is also Africans trying to create a world that actually expands the space and creates a space for their liberation and for their freedom, sort of a space where their freedom is ignored, where under slavery, they're rendered into social death. They become chattel property. They're not only denied rights, but as Gerald Horne, the very prominent African-American historian, points out, it's not just simply a denial of their rights, it's a denial of their right to have rights. Their very humanity is denied. And so what they do is they create a space in which humanity can flourish, right? And in which ideas of freedom, particularly from the Haitian Revolution, ideas of freedom, liberty, and human emancipation go far beyond the ideas that are encompassed in the French Revolution and in the so-called American Revolution, the American War of Independence. So one of the things that I think that's important that comes out of the transatlantic slave trade is not only the trauma, the oppression, it's not only the unequal world order that then springs from the transatlantic slave trade, it's also the fact that Africans, right, are the makers of history. The makers of their own history. Yes, people don't make history under conditions that they choose, and those conditions that they inherit can shape what their choices are and what they can accomplish. But within those conditions, people do attempt to seize on to their freedom. And within this, what has happened in the dominant discourse is that Africans are robbed of their role as subjects of history and reduced to mere objects who are passive, hapless victims, as I said, mere spectators and bystanders in the struggle against their own oppression and exploitation. And so within this, as I pointed out in my lecture, the Haitian Revolution best amplified this. Why did it best amplify this African struggle for liberation? It's that, one, not only did they defeat the French, the Spanish, the British, and then the French again, but they challenged, okay, the racial hierarchy that existed, right? And more importantly, they established, okay, themselves as intellectual authors, right? They derived much of their social, political, and moral force from their own African experience and thinking. Much is made of the Haitian Revolution, as I pointed out in my last lecture, that many of its ideas came from the French Revolution. And there's no doubt that the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity were very important sparks in the Haitian Revolution. But Africans had their own thought material. As I pointed out, 2/3 of the close to 500,000 Africans who rose in revolt in 1791 had been born in Africa. That points tremendously that 2/3 were born in Africa in 1791 to the incredible mortality rate and brutality of the exploitation of enslaved Africans in Haiti. I could perhaps inundate you with stories from journals and eyewitness accounts of the brutality that were inflicted on enslaved Africans in Haiti, from people being buried up to their heads and molasses being poured on their heads if they were seen as being too disobedient, and allowing them to be eaten alive by insects. These stories are well documented and so forth. But what I want to focus on is that because 2/3 of the enslaved Africans at the time of 1791, okay, had been born in Africa. This, as I said before, speaks to the fact that they had their own thought material, their own independent thinking to guide them forth. So in many ways, the transatlantic slave trade, okay, with its brutality, its horrors, its degradation, okay, is also challenged by Africans who try to push back against it and create their own space in which their humanity can be realized. A point I should make as well is that in concert with the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and the brutal exploitation of Africans is the Enlightenment movement, is the Renaissance as well as it goes forward, right? But particularly the Enlightenment. And so quite often people speak of the Black Atlantic. And when these people speak of the Black Atlantic, they're speaking of this world and these conceptions that Africans have created in the Americas, okay, connected with Africa through the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. It's both a geographical entity, but also a metaphorical conception. And within this, Africans create an anti-enlightenment. Why? Because the Enlightenment perhaps would not have been, actually, would have been impossible without the wealth gained from Africa. As people are talking throughout the Enlightenment, the dominant thinkers are talking about rights and challenging absolute rule, and talking about expanding the envelope of the envelope of rights and freedoms that encompasses more people. They are not including Africans. Africans are not part of that discussions. And so as Africans are excluded from the discussion of who is a human being and who deserves rights, they themselves are establishing through their resistance and their rebellion, particularly with the Haitian Revolution being at the pinnacle, their argument that not only are we human beings, but because of the very nature of our oppression, we will generate a much more fuller and authentic conception of what a just society means when it recognizes rights. So, as I said before, enslaved Africans derived much of their social, political, and moral force from their own thinking, from their own African experience, heritage, and thinking. As William Rucker underscores, a major writer on slave rebellions, slaves were human beings as well as Africans from specific social, political, and cultural backgrounds. It would only seem logical that the types of resistance engaged in by slaves were largely determined and shaped by the African past. Europe was and is not the only source or generator for ideas of freedom, justice, and liberation. While quite correctly, as I stated, the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity from the French Revolution played a role in the Haitian Revolution, it is crucial, in my opinion, and others, to accentuate that the enslaved Africans, the majority of whom were African-born, had their own ideas and conception, their own African thought material upon which to draw and base the struggle for a new society. And I think this is critically important. Africans, in a sense, are at the center of their own story of the end of slavery, the abolition of slavery. They are the principal and active agents, okay? And this agency has embodied more than just physical arms of resistance. Africans were also the intellectual authors of their own emancipatory projects. So coming out of the transatlantic slave trade to this African resistance, what has often been ignored is the intellectual contribution and the practical contribution Africans are making to what true and authentic emancipation means. What does a true society in which the rights of all are respected? Africans, through their resistance, right, are making this contribution. And of course, it's important to understand that these examples of African resistance, particularly the Haitian Revolution, are immediately born into conditions of siege. The European powers impose a cordon sanitaire around them to crush these examples of African freedom. And it's important to understand that the Haitian Revolution, when it exploded, right, you know, for example, granted honorary citizens to those Europeans who stood with them against slavery. I think this is often forgotten, and that the Haitian Revolution itself provided assistance, right? And in one case, refuge for Simon Bolivar, who's often referred to as the great liberator, and who led many of the liberation struggles against Spanish colonialism in South America. So, and it's also important to see that moreover in the Caribbean, in Haiti, and the Americas, this resistance and rebellion signaled the emergence and crystallization of a Pan-African consciousness. It used to be argued that the mix of different nationalities and ethnic groups from Africa was almost an insurmountable barrier to African unity. In short, it was an unbridgeable diversity, which was an obstacle to organized slavery resistance, as Rucker points out, end of quote. However, the frequency and extent of African rebellion refute this assertion. To the contrary, African culture and Pan-African connections brought together enslaved Africans from various backgrounds and facilitated resistance, and efforts to randomize Africans on slave ships and on auction blocks had utterly failed to prevent collaboration and resistance. Here at least is one example, as I point out, of the failure of the strategy divide and rule. So in the panorama of African liberation, in the panorama of humanity trying to come up with various conceptions of what a just society is, African resistance with the Haitian Revolution at the center is decisive. It was a seminal, the Haitian Revolution was a seminal struggle against slavery and a critical chronological marker in its slavery demise, as I and others have argued. But what's important is African resistance was decisive for other colonized peoples. In the groundbreaking Silencing the Past, the Power and Reproduction of History, Rolf Trouillot emphasizes that the revolution, Haitian Revolution, and other examples of African resistance pose as never before claims about the right of all peoples to self-determination, and through its political practice challenged Western philosophy and colonialism. And more importantly, African resistance, in the conditions in which they operated, demonstrated the capacity of all oppressed and exploited peoples to resist. And I've noted elsewhere that this legacy endures, okay, that oppressed people are not just simply passive observers or powerless victims, but the active, conscious force in their own liberation. So in this context, when we talk about this, one of the things that really we must focus on as well, since we're talking in the context of Canada, is what does this mean for Canada? What does this legacy of the transatlantic slave trade mean for Canada? And quite often, as Dr. Fuwa Cooper has pointed out, slavery itself, okay, is Canada's deeply hidden secret, the unknown story, okay, that many governments have basically argued didn't exist. So what of Canada? Where does Canada fit in the transatlantic slave system? And as I said, quite often, Canada is presented as if slavery never occurred here, and it's a phenomenon completely outside of Canada. Dr. Cooper, in a seminal book, The Hanging of Angelique, okay, and the untold story of slavery, the burning of Montreal, and the untold story of slavery in Canada, has pointed out it's Canada's deep secret. As Harvey Whitfield notes in his groundbreaking work, Black Slavery in the Maritimes, A History of Documents, he notes, the introduction and development of slavery in the New World is among the most important elements in global history. resulting in the growth of a lucrative and exploitative labor system justified by perceived racial differences. Slavery existed throughout the so-called New World, from Chile and Argentina in the south to Nova Scotia in the north. It is not surprising that slavery played a part in Canadian history. And in fact, what we have discovered is that one of the most egregious parts of this history is the fact that the financial connections are being ignored. But this history has received little recognition and attention outside of specialized historians. It's important to note that the marginalizations of people of African descent in Canada has its historical roots in the institution of slavery. While the institution of slavery perhaps in Canada never acquired the dimensions it had in the United States or elsewhere in the Americas, its influence and impact exceeded its actual size and economic weight, shaping how persons of African descent were perceived and treated in Canada. As an aside, researchers and scholars such as Carolyn Smart-Frost, Dr. Afua Cooper, Amani Whitfield, and others are unearthing that we had many, many more enslaved Africans than have been acknowledged. That the number of enslaved Africans in the official records is smaller than the fact that there was in private records, in wills, in other activities that don't enter the official records, that the number is much greater, and that slavery in its weight and numbers is much larger than we anticipated. The very existence and practice of slavery in Canada established the precedent of using African peoples as a readily available source of cheap labor. It also established a constellation of worldviews, of practices and dynamics that marginalized even African peoples who came to Canada who were normally free. And it established within that the idea that Africans themselves were not deserving of full citizenship in Canada itself. In my work on African Nova Scotian history, the dynamic shaped the experience of the Black loyalists, over 3,500 legally free men and women in the British Empire who came to Nova Scotia in the 1780s. We have over 2,000 Black refugees who came after the War of 1812. Okay, these were two of the largest migrant, if not the two largest migrant groups to the Maritimes, forming the foundation for the historical Black community. They became designated as cheap labor, and this was based on the precedents of slavery, right? And they were reduced to the dependent position, marginalized and disenfranchised. Entwined with this economic status was the racist ideology deployed to justify and ensure that people of African descent remained at the bottom of the socioeconomic order. A constellation of social practices, as I pointed out, conventions, ideas, and worldviews emerged from slavery in the Americas and in Canada, which would shape the trajectories of Black communities long after slavery itself was abolished. That is the afterlife. This history profoundly stamped the subsequent trajectory of Black Canadian communities, okay? Whether it was Black Nova Scotian communities or among the oldest here in Canada, whether it was the people who stayed behind in Southern Ontario after the Underground Railroad and other communities as well. The results have been marginalization and disenfranchisement, epitomized, for example, by the dispossession of Africville, the Black community that was raised in the late 1960s, and so on. This legacy, this continuity with the past, was recognized by the United Nations 2017 report of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent on its mission to Canada, which underscored the role of slavery in shaping the history of African Canadians, laying the foundation for anti-Black racism, the discrimination and marginalization of African Canadians. The report is quite unequivocal and unambiguous about this direct historical path, and I quote, "Canada's history of enslavement, racial segregation and marginalization has had a deleterious impact on people of African descent. Across the country, many people of African descent continue to live in poverty and poor health, have low educational attainment, and are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. It is important to underline that the experience of African Canadians is unique because of the particular history of anti-Black racism in Canada, which is traceable to slavery and its legacy, through specific laws, practices enforcing segregation in education, residential accommodation, employment, and other economic opportunities. These consequences," end of quote, "these consequences, as the report underscores, can be measured today. The outcomes are particularly poignant in the socioeconomic in the socioeconomic sphere, where the poverty rate among Black Canadians is more than 3 times the average for whites. In 2000, 1 in 2 African Canadian children lived below the low income cutoff rate before taxes, compared to 1 in 10 for European Canadians. And I could go on. Furthermore, poverty among single parents, mother-led families, stood at 65% for African Canadian families, compared to 26% for European Canadian families. And there are more data I can go in. It's always difficult to get this data, okay, because it becomes quite challenging, right, when one approaches Statistics Canada. So it's just within this context that many people have spoken about specifically a struggle for reparations, that there's this afterlife for slavery. And both within Canada and internationally, this call for reparations is linked to understanding that slavery is not just some distant past system. There's an afterlife that's springing from slavery, springing from this legacy of degradation and humiliation, from this coerced labor, that there's a world, international financial structure, and economic inequities and inequalities that spring from the long history of over 300 years of the exploitation, oppression, and degradation and traumatic treatment of enslaved Africans. And springing from that is not only the superstructure that has emerged in the world and the economic infrastructure, it is also the marginalization and disenfranchisement of Africans. And in many ways, the call for reparations is not only an acknowledgement, okay, that there must be something, right, to redress these inequities. It's also acknowledgement that when in the British Empire in particular, that when slavery came to an end in 1834 in the British Empire, not only was there an attempt to enforce a long period of apprenticeship, but the only people who were compensated, despite a debate in Parliament, were the plantation owners. Africans were never compensated for the hundreds of years of coerced and unpaid labor. And when the Caribbean islands were becoming independent, okay, they went to the British government and said, you owe us compensation. You have derived and you have bled us dry. Okay, you have derived wealth from us. Okay, and therefore you owe us assistance as we become independent countries and try to make our way in the world. And that was denied. That was denied. That is why there is an international suit by the Caribbean Community of Nations, what we call CARICOM, for its an acronym, that has brought a case against Britain, France, and other Western European countries for reparations, for the extermination of the indigenous peoples, and for the impact of slavery. And in a sense, this is part and parcel of what is referred to as perhaps the right to development. In 1986, there was the passing of the Declaration of the Right to Development. Okay, it was an acknowledgement that the Universal Declaration of Rights, Declaration of Human Rights, passed in 1949, which included social and economic rights, has slowly been interpreted to only refer to a doctrine of individual human rights. Okay, that is, it was specifically interpreted by the powers that be to oppose and to deny the collective right to development. What reparation involves is the call to provide the resources, but more importantly, to create a society, okay, to achieve the goals of human development for the citizens, right? To basically achieve the conditions in which the development of people of African descent, which have been curtailed, which in fact have been denied by a long history of oppression, beginning with slavery and then being metamorphosized into different forms of exclusion and marginalization in the history of colonialism, that the call for reparations is simply a call in order to create the conditions in which Africans, right, can actually, of African descent, both on the continent, but specifically in the Americas, can have the conditions in which they can achieve true human development in the education and in the health and in other social fields as well. So the call for reparations is not just simply, I should underline as Dr. Hurley Beckles underlined, it's not just simply a call for funds that will be given willy-nilly to people of African descent. It's not just simply a call to restructure the social and economic relations that have basically curtailed and oppressed and denied Africans the full flowering of the humanity. It's a call for the restructuring of society in such a way that will benefit all of humanity. One of the things that perhaps has not been discussed or has been pushed to the sidelines recently has been the latest report from the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change. I encourage those of you to read that report. It just came out over a month ago. This report is frightening when it looks at the impact of climate change across the world. And as many people have pointed out, the people who will suffer the most from this ecological catastrophe are the people who have been colonized the most. And perhaps the most thoroughly colonized region of the world has been the Caribbean and those parts of the Americas that have faced, the transatlantic slave trade. They're the ones who are specifically going to lose land and their residences and living space because of the rising sea levels. They're the ones who are going to be the most vulnerable to increasing hurricanes and other kind of environmental disasters that will happen. So the call for reparations is not just simply a call to that will benefit only Africans. It's a call to transform the world in a way that will help repair, at least stave off the worst of this ecological catastrophe and create a world that's fit for all human beings, not just Africans. So Africans, by their particular historical location in this over 300 years of enslavement, followed by disenfranchisement, marginalization, and segregation that was the afterlife of the transatlantic slave trade, are in a unique position to make a call to create a space that is truly emancipatory. And the space that is truly emancipatory will create, I argue, and others have argued, the opportunity to create a truly emancipated world that will benefit all human beings on this planet. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the question and answers. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sani. That was incredible, and certainly, so many things resonate. And I'll probably start with one of the points you made at the very end. But before that, I just want to let the audience know, please go to the Q&A feature and drop your questions there. And we're going to be talking about them in a minute or so. So feel free to just write your questions in the chat, in the Q&A feature, and I'll read them for Dr. Sani to try and answer. But just your point about the IPCC report on climate change, the sixth assessment report, and how absolutely terrifying it is. And you're absolutely right about the impacts on certain countries, and particularly that group of countries typically referred to as SIDS, small island developing states, and all the countries in the Caribbean really fits into that. I mean, even Suriname and Guyana, who are not islands really, but are going to be impacted as well. So very, very scary. And I know Caribbean governments are paying attention about what that is going to mean.
Sorry, Claire, I think you're so powerful on that, because they're going to disappear. It's frightening to see this. We all know that natural disasters are mediated through class and race. We only have to think in 2005 of what happened in Hurricane Katrina. Who suffers, right? Who are the people who pay these prices, right? And the same thing with the ecological crisis. I think the super rich and powerful perhaps believe they can insulate themselves from it, and they'll have the power to do it. But it's frightening for the Caribbean. It just happens that it will be the global South, and particularly Black people, who will suffer the most from this, right? And when I was thinking about this, and I'm sorry, and you see this, and I have to bring this up, you see this unfolding in the current crisis in the Ukraine. Okay, like whose lives are valued, right? Okay, yes, people who suffer from war, we all feel for Ukrainians who are dying in this war, right? We all feel for refugees, right? But the fact that people are how the Jamaicans, for example, and African students were treated in Ukraine when they were going to Poland, and the fact that what's happened in Yemen, for example, where the UN predicts 1.2 million people are in danger of starvation, and nobody seems to care. So whose lives are valued? The fact that when people drown and going across the Mediterranean, right, people don't realize that when people get on those ships, there's a hierarchy, and the darker you are, the lower you sit in the ship. So that's why so many drown, right? And you mentioned my work in Cuba. It's really interesting that I know Cuba can be a controversial topic, but the Cubans actually have a plan until 2100 to deal with climate change, right? And they're the only country in the Americas, right, that have acknowledged that they're a Latin African nation. They're the only country to have gone before the United Nations and say that, and the UN Security Council, and say that humanity owes a debt to Africa, right? So I have a book coming out in a couple months, right, with Lexington book called Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return, that focuses on this, right? And one can answer the question, why? We can argue why Cuba is acknowledging this, but the point is there is this debt owed to Africa. And with this economic crisis and this ecological catastrophe that faces us, we know who are the people who are going to suffer the most. So I feel very passionate about this. And this, when I read the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Parliamentary report on climate change, I was frightened. I have a 3.5-year-old daughter. What world is she going to live in? And when I look online, most people see this world as being not only very dystopian, but as the future being very dystopian. And if it's dystopian for everyone, it's going to be particularly dystopian for those who are the most marginalized and disenfranchised.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I don't
my apologies, but
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that is very, very important. I don't believe we can overemphasize this. The importance of this, and for the Caribbean, I mean, it's absolutely an existential question, which makes it an imperative.
And it becomes an existential crisis for Canadians, because so many Canadians have roots in the Caribbean, right? Like half my roots lie in the Black Nova Scotian community. So I go back, my mother goes back several generations, right? But I also have roots in Trinidad and Tobago, and we have friends. This is an existential crisis for people, right? Just as an example, if you have roots in Europe, you're allowed to validate those roots, right? Okay. The same thing for people from the Caribbean. That's part of who we are.
Yeah, well said. So we have a couple of questions, and I'm going to get to them. But I wanted to ask, that notion, this ridiculous notion about the capacity of enslaved Africans to articulate what freedom meant and all of that, which there's just no historical evidence for it at all. I mean, to the contrary, you look at the history of our resistance and revolt in the Caribbean, all across the Caribbean. There are a lot of stories, from Jamaica, and I wanted to point to something, because of the connection with Canada and Nova Scotia. But in 1796, after the Second Maroon War, right, over 500 so-called troublemakers, right, were rounded up, and in July, 3 ships actually landed in Halifax with these people, and the history tells us that they became involved in the building of Citadel Hill and some of that stuff. So I just wondered, in that context, we speak of Black Nova Scotians These Maroons who came there, and I think the plan was to repatriate them to Sierra Leone. Were they involved in that history in terms of the development of Nova Scotia and that culture of liberation?
Well, most of them left in 1800. But when they came to Nova Scotia, they participated in building the third fortifications of Citadel Hill. And Citadel Hill was the most important infrastructure in Halifax because it was seen as an important bulwark by the British Empire against French incursion, right? And the Maroons themselves was also seen as a military counterweight that the British could use, right? But what's interesting about them, so they came here, is that the Maroon history in Jamaica is very interesting because you mentioned the second Maroon War, right? Because most of the Maroons left and went to Sierra Leone, right? Because they refused to allow them, the British couldn't subjugate them, couldn't put them under the dictate, and the British decided to send them to Sierra Leone. But the first Maroon War, there was a treaty that came out of it. And when you read that treaty, here you have Jamaica, here you have the British Empire in a slave society, but they acknowledged they couldn't beat the Maroons, okay? I mean, some people argue the Maroons were close to defeat at some points, but the British couldn't defeat them. And they had to acknowledge Maroon independence and freedom in the midst of a slave society. That was incredibly unique. What's interesting is, they had to acknowledge that they couldn't defeat the Maroons. They had to acknowledge that they had to accept the independence, even though they didn't want to do that, and freedom. But what's interesting, when you see portrayals, British portrayals, right, of the negotiations, they always portray the Maroons as debased human beings because it's a cognitive dissonance in the racial hierarchy. But I want to make an important point here, which is really interesting. If we go back to the Black Loyalists, so 3005, I just had an article published on the Dial News about the Black Loyalists. Okay, in 3,500 Black Loyalists come to Nova Scotia after the War of Independence. The British, then when they were fighting the 13 colonies, they needed military personnel, so they promised through different proclamations freedom for Africans who would join them. Right, 3,000 when the British lose, 3,500 end up coming to Nova Scotia. Broken promises, not giving their land, not giving the provisions, reduced to cheap labor, all sorts of broken promises. They then, through mass democratic consultation, decide to send somebody to the seat of power of the British Empire, which is London. His name was Thomas Peters. He goes there, meets with abolitionists, makes his case, and finds out about this project of the Sierra Leone Company of creating a refuge in Sierra Leone. So he goes back to Nova Scotia, and eventually they organize an 1,196 Black Loyalists in the largest single Back to Africa movement, leave in 1792, go to Sierra Leone. Now, what's interesting here is that they had conceptions of their civil rights. They wanted decision making. And in the Western world, this is the point I want to make. In the Western world, the first example of women having the right to vote is in that Black Loyalist community in Sierra Leone. Okay, and people talk about political thinking, right? I mean, it's astonishing. I think, when I was talking about the Haitian Revolution, what's most bizarre about the Haitian Revolution, when one thinks about it, is that, you have, the French Revolution takes place. Haiti is a French colony, the most profitable of all the European colonies and so forth. Every European power, the British and the Spanish, wanted to seize Haiti from the French. But the French Revolution takes place. You have regicide. The king is killed. You have, this whole idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And these ideas have now percolated or come down to Haiti. And so what's happening is these ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and we talked about African ideas, obviously are going to have the greatest resonance and meaning and relevance to enslaved Africans. And yet these plantation owners are talking about these ideas, talking about what's happening in Europe. There's journals, right, for example, about this, where they're keeping their diaries, and they're talking about this among the enslaved Africans who are working among them, as either serving them their food or in their plantations, because they believe Africans are intellectually incapable of understanding this. So there's one journal, I've read a diary, where this guy says, freedom is a chimera to our Africans. They can't understand it, right? And then about a month later, after he writes that, 100,000 enslaved Africans in North Haiti rise to overthrow the oppressive structure of slavery, and then it spreads throughout the country. So it's deeply embedded, the intellectual inferiority of Africans, right, and people of African descent. And I mean, all of us can talk about the paternalism, the condescension we faced, right? Okay, or where we get exoticized, right? Okay. okay, or where you get, oh my God, you can think, you can talk, and some of that's supposed to be an anomaly and an aberration and so forth. So these ideas of Black inferiority, these ideas where the Black claim on humanity, right, is either problematic or qualified, okay, or denied, are deeply rooted in this long institution of enslavement itself.
Thanks, Isaac. So I have a question in respect to language, and Leila is asking, in respect to language and justice, how can we practice shifting the discourse on enslavement from a white supremacist colonial perspective to an anti-colonial perspective in, for example, alternatives to calling the atrocities, you know, a slave trade, implying and objectifying, you know, human beings are goods, property to be exchanged?
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful point. And I think we need to develop a new lexicon, a new vocabulary, right? So I often like to use the word enslaved Africans as opposed to slaves, but I think even enslaved Africans itself is not adequate in and of itself. Even the slave trade, like, you know, the point is it's human beings, right? You know, who are being enslaved, human, and in fact, it's, you know, it's young and able-bodied people who are, you know, who have been taken from Africa, right? And the impact on the societies. So I think this is one of the next steps to develop that lexicon. Right? Barrington Walker, in an essay here in his book, talks about, and I was reading, it was very powerful. He talks about how we have sort of like, I remember I used the word voyeurism, right? Okay, I was going to use a stronger P. I was going to stronger P word, but I think I want a voyeurism about African suffering and trauma, right? To where the point it actually reinforces white supremacy, where Africans are victims and so on, right? That's why I think the focus on the thinking that Africans were doing, right? The fact that even within these conditions, they were thinking and conceiving not of limited concepts of emancipation, but of broad concepts of emancipations, politically, and also encompassing all of humanity. So I agree with the person. We need to start coming up with new vocabulary and perhaps find a new term for the transatlantic slave system, right? Now, there are others who would argue that we shouldn't diminish the fact that they were enslaved. They were reduced to chattel property.
And that they were chattel, yes.
They were reduced to social death, right?
Yes.
And as Gerald Horne very pointedly makes, it's not just a denial of rights, it's a denial of the right to have rights, okay? Because if I deny your rights, and I'm saying I'm denying your rights, I'm assuming that you have rights, that you're a human being, but it was even the denial of humanity. So I think in the course of time, we have to develop a new lexicon, a new vocabulary, but perhaps it's not that, it's the framework in which we talk about it, right? So in my courses, when I teach on it, I obviously, there's all this oppression and suffering and so forth, but I spend a lot of time later on speaking about African thought material, African resisting, right? And Africans trying to preserve their humanity, right? Okay, and that's one thing I like about Tony Martin's book. It spends a lot of time on resistance, but it also shows how Africans, in a sense, reclaim their humanity. So I'll give one last example here. When we talk about resistance, and you were talking about the Caribbean, in Canada, we didn't have the kind of rebellions that took place, but we have a form of resistance. And Dr. Cooper and I, put in for a project, right, where we're going to be focusing on Africans resisting in the Caribbean, in Canada, in the Canadas, which is through escaping ads, right? So when you read the escape ads, you quite often get, obviously, through the lens of either the so-called slave catcher or the person trying to reclaim, quote unquote, his property, or her property sometimes, what you get is a much more detailed description of these individuals. And quite often the description gives you a sense of them trying to express their humanity. Because one of the things that comes out of the slave trade and the transatlantic slave system is the fungibility of Africans. Each one is interchangeable, right? There's no individuality, no humanity, right? And so you find in these escape ads, you find examples of people expressing their individuality and their humanity as they reclaim it. So I agree with the question, and a lot of people are still wrestling with trying to find a new lexicon, but perhaps reshaping the story in a way that fundamentally centers African humanity and agency.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Isaac, and thanks, Leila, for that question. Great question, and I think you made a great point. Starting to think about it, rather than focusing on the African slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. Talking more about the transatlantic slave system, which was a manifestation of a particular philosophy, related to the global political economy. So Jacqueline asks, how can we even begin to calculate remuneration for 300 years of abuse? It hurts my head just thinking about it. Who would stand up and accept responsibility today for the terrible things of the past?
Yeah, I think that's a powerful question, right? How was one calculate for the trauma? I even talked about the psychological consequences, right? The late great, I will call him the great Norman Gervan, who was a political economist from the Caribbean and a very good friend of mine. We used to talk about this, right? We used to talk about how does one, not just the economic, not trauma, for the psychological consequences, right? That took a long time to overcome. I gave a lecture today on Marcus Garvey in my course, because Marcus Garvey has an interconnection with Canada, and many people may not know that Bob Marley's Redemption song is actually based on is built around as a quotation from a speech that Marcus Garvey gave in 1937 in Sydney, Nova Scotia. Okay, so I spoke about this, right? So and Garvey was a lot about repairing the psychological and emotional damage that was done, right? Okay, how do we do this, right? Okay, and that's immense. How do you calculate this? But we know that there is, for example, precedents for this. So we know that Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians have been compensated. We know that Germany has paid reparations, right, for the Holocaust, for the attempt to exterminate European Jewry. We know, for example, just recently, the British government had to pay reparations for for those who were oppressed by the British, right? The victims when the British oppressed in the Land and Freedom Uprising, right? What people usually call the Mau Mau, right? Uprising. And I should recommend it's a beautiful poem by Nicolas Guillen from Cuba on this, right? Okay, so we know they've paid these reparations. How do you compensate? I think for me, when you look at the fact that these historical processes I was sort of briefly talking about are the precursors and foundations for today's global distribution of wealth and power, for me, the issue of reparations is a world issue, right? And it's not just simply about calculating the money. It's about saying the world we live in today is fundamentally unsustainable, both in terms of its political and social structure, but in terms of what it's wreaking on the environment and the ecology. And much of that is built from, obviously, the dispossession of the indigenous peoples and the attempt to eliminate them physically in the Americas. Let's not forget that, right? And then within that, that sets the stage for the mass enslavement of Africans, the spoiling of the African continent, later on with the European race to control it, but of course, the brutal exploitation of Africans. So for me, reparations is not just simply about money, right, and calculation of money. It's about transforming the social relations, right? The relations between human beings and between nations, right? And I think that's a fundamental thing that will benefit all of us, right? But in terms of money, there are people who have tried to do the calculations, right? I know in the United States, there are political economists who sat down and tried to calculate what is the value of that unpaid labor, right? Okay, and so on, right? And of course, there's that famous letter, and I wish I could pull it up here, of the guy who writes back to his master, right? After, so-called owner, plantation owner, after he's freed in the United States, right? So he escapes from slavery, right? Goes in the north, and, the plantation owner is going through all sorts of difficulties, and he says, "Why don't you come back," right? And the guy writes him a letter and says, "Listen, this is how much you owe me and my wife for unpaid labor," right? So people have tried to do these calculations. There's a book that came out called Accounting for Slavery, produced by a Harvard professor that tries to do this calculation. But it's difficult to do this calculation, but I think one can say, here's the value of wealth that's been produced, okay? And one can come up with sort of like a guesstimation between this limit and that limit, okay? And it's a beginning. But at the end of the day, I think unless we have a fundamental transformation of social relations, the humanity isn't going to survive, or we're going to live in a very dystopian future. So I know that's another satisfying.
Yeah.
But there are people attempting to do this calculation. So, for example, in CARICOM, if I may, CARICOM, their reparations thing calls for an education fund and calls for certain, and Beckles has constructed. This is the kind of stuff we need, right? And what he also talks about, it's not just a one-off. It's people working together, right? Okay. That, you have done me a harm, and a payoff isn't reparations. It's when you say, listen, I've done you a harm, and I'm going to help you step by step overcome this harm that I've inflicted on you.
Yeah, thanks, Isaac, and thanks for that question, Jacqueline. I think,
thank you for that.
you're absolutely right.
And I encourage people to read Hilary Beckel's work.
Yes.
I had a list of books, but he wrote a book called The British Debt to Black People, right? Which sort of provides the beginning of an answer to that.
Yeah, and Jacqueline, I take your fundamental point that, you can't put a price on the trauma of it all. So, as you mentioned, reparations paid for the Holocaust. There's a question here that asks, was the slave trade a Holocaust by definition?
Well,
in your opinion.
My point, it's a huge crime against humanity. Yeah. Probably the longest lasting crime against humanity. If we state, like, I think it's, people point to different years, 1512, and when we have the first record of Africans being transported. And if they go from 1512 to 1888 when it's abolishment, it's the longest lasting crime against humanity, right? The impact on Africa, which I haven't spoken about, Walter Rodney speaks about that, right? The fact that for a long period of time, Africa's population remained stagnant, not because, because not only the number of people were taken, but precisely who was taken and the impact on African economic and social life and so forth. So, people argue Holocaust, this and that. People get upset when you use the word Holocaust and so on. It's a crime against humanity. It's the longest lasting crime against humanity. And, I don't believe in providing hierarchies of oppressions in that sense. But at the end of the day, if people have called it the Mafa, for example. Some people use the word the Mafa to describe it, the Great Mafa, okay? And people use the word Holocaust, the impact it's had on African societies indicate that African societies were destroyed, okay? And the development was completely constrained, right? And, one of the things I didn't talk about here, and I thought about it, but I was at length, was to list the West African societies that existed at that time. Okay, who, and how their trajectories were reduced to being dependent on Europe, or some of them just disintegrated and so forth. When you talk about, 300 years, okay, whichever term you use, it's a crime against humanity, right?
Yeah.
And what's important, and the last thing I want to make about this is that when it was going on, there was a debate about it. People writing about it, who's saying this is wrong, this is against natural justice and so forth. And so people often say, well, that's how people thought back in that time. But no, I can go back and find you quotes from different people who point out that this, at the height of the slave trade, this is a moral wrong, this is a violation of natural justice, and we owe a moral obligation to Africans and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head. My own view is, calling it a Holocaust or not, really, doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be called a Holocaust to have legitimacy in terms of its impact on people. And for me, I agree with you 100%. It was a crime against humanity, that's the end of it, really. It was a crime. It was a great crime against humanity. There's another question here. So reparations are important today in the way you are raising them because the economic and historic situations of the Caribbeans and Americas and life of peoples are not coming from nowhere. Do you have examples from life now of demands coming from conferences and decisions coming from the peoples that are discussed? So are there examples of some of, and I think you mentioned some of that when you talked about the Caribbean context and what Hillary was is articulating, but what are some of the examples in terms of what needs to be done in terms of reparations?
That's a big example. People have debated over the CARICOM, right? So right now, at one point I was supervising a PhD dissertation. We were looking at the CARICOM case for reparations, right? So how it would fit in with would it fulfill the development areas? So I remember when Norman Govan and I would have conversations. One of the things he was concerned about was reparations cannot be just kept to, say, an education fund, for example, right? Because, Clinton, you and I are examples of, we're part of the brain drain. We're here in Canada. Okay, and people calculate that the brain drain to the so-called global south is worth $50 to $100 billion a year. because people leave. So the question was basically, the CARICOM structure itself calls for an educational, but calls for things around trade and other things aspects as well, right? So if we go back further, and people may have forgotten this, in the 1970s, I should go back further. In 1955, they had the Bandung Conference, right, in Indonesia. And that began what was called a Third World Project, right? And that was bringing together independent countries of the Global South to begin to talk about a unified call, specifically to talk about where they would fit into the world economy, and also to challenge what they saw as an unfair and unequal way the economy was structured. Where would they fit in as former colonial countries? And this became what's called the Third World Project, and it radicalized at some points. Then we had the formation of non-aligned movement. And then in the 70s emerged the new International Economic Order, new NIEO, the drive for that. It's been forgotten. And they called for the end of unequal and unfair terms of trade, right? They called for technology transfer. They called for the control of multinational corporations. So in the sense that multinational corporations would be required not only not to extract so much in profits, but also to transfer technology and know-how. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development had a technology division led by Surendra Patel, who actually developed some of the first development plans for independent African countries, who focused on this, right? And you had NI and Carrie Pollyanna Leffert and oh my goodness, your namesake from Jamaica, Beckford, right? Okay, George Beckford, right? Okay, and even people like Michael Ritter and even Gordon Lewis talked about the development plan, and Norman Govan and all these guys, right? So the issue was that at the end of the day, right, reparations means nothing if the money is going to be frittered away from the island, right? Because they're from the islands, or even from the country, because the way the economy operates, right, with unequal terms of trade, many of the countries in primary, is that we have a siphoning off of wealth. When people look at, they talk about the aid that goes to the Caribbean. What about and Latin America? Actually, much greater is transferred, not only in profit repatriation by transnational corporations, but in debt repayments, right? And we know what structural adjustment these programs meant. So many people are saying reparations in itself is a means to an end, right? It's a means to open up the discussion, right, on what meaningful change will mean in order to guarantee the right to development, right, for these countries and so forth, right? So in the structure of the CARICOM, it involves a number of things related to, education, but also providing the efforts, right, for countries to develop, right, around terms of trade and so on, right? That becomes a central point. And Norman and I were very concerned about, particularly Norman, because he was still based in the Caribbean, right, about the fact that unless we alter the fundamental economic structure international in which these countries are embedded, how much money you give them will often be siphoned off, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. And that, that discussion by the, that philosophical set of thinkers in the Caribbean known as the Plantation School, right?
Yeah, Plantation School of Beckford and other people. Yeah.
Absolutely fundamental. Yeah, absolutely.
I make a point as well. This gets back to the intellectual stuff as well. Like when it comes to the Caribbean, and I used to have this happen, we're often seen as fun, reggae, partying, calypso, right? Okay. The thinkers, not I'm against my good partying because I love my soca and my reggae, leave that aside, but the rich, fertile thinkers from the Caribbean, like the stuff that's being produced, right? It's truly amazing.
Yes. Absolutely. Second to none. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Couldn't agree with you more. And doesn't get the attention that it deserves, quite frankly.
Yeah.
So this is a really interesting question. With your research expertise on Cuba and South America at large, how does anti-Blackness create unique complexities for Afro-Latinx peoples based on the figure that a large percentage of enslaved Africans were brought to Latin America and how the history of enslavement is predominantly remembered from the United States?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. So one point, I never got through my full PowerPoint because once I started reading my text, right? So one of the things is that when you look at the figures, 35 to 40% of all enslaved Africans brought across the Atlantic ended up in Brazil. Brazil is the country with the second largest Black population in the world. Only Nigeria has a larger population. 40 to 45% of all enslaved Africans ended up in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean population is so small, so that speaks to the attrition, right? I always like to point out that Latin America is obsessed, and even the Caribbean, obsessed with race, right? Okay, so in North America, we always have the, one drop of black blood makes you black, right? Okay, in North America, right? In the Caribbean, sometimes people, and in the Latin America, some people hope that one drop of white blood makes you closer to white, right? Okay, and so in places like Brazil and other places, there's dozens of ways in which you classify even full brothers, full siblings by complexion.
Yes.
Like I look very different than my sisters, right? Okay, okay, by complexion, hair texture, because genetics is a funny thing, right? And so we also have this big problem psychologically of skin lightening, right? Okay, it's I have a lot of students who write about it, about what does this mean psychologically, what does it mean in terms of how do they value their blackness, right? And beauty standards and all this sort of stuff. So there's an obsession with this in Latin America, right? Okay, and so on. Like for example, when people one of the questions some people ask you might be, ¿de dónde está tu abuela? Which literally means, where is your grandmother from? But what it actually means is, what color is your grandmother? Because people are obsessed with race, right? People talk about liking that. So in Latin America, we also have the denial of the black presence in Latin America. So Brazil, denies officially how big the black population is. I mean, if you watch the World Cup audiences in the 2014 World Cup, okay, you would get a completely different vision of Brazil. When I look at the Brazilian students who are studying here, you get a completely different vision. Brazil for a long time ignored the fact that there was a race problem, ignored the fact that the universities were predominantly by light and white Brazilians and so forth. And so this became a big issue, right? If I speak, where I know most about is Cuba. I've written a lot on race in Cuba. I have a couple of chapters in books and so forth. And in my own book on Cuba, which is popular, I speak a lot about race. Cuba is a unique situation, right? Okay, in the sense that because Cuba has had what people refer to as an anti-capitalist or socialist revolution, whatever you believe about this. And I could spend a long time talking about it, right? But the important point is that Cubans thought they had, when the revolution triumphed, black Cubans benefited the most, right, materially, right, okay? But that did not eliminate racial inequality in Cuba, because there were still big inequalities that the revolution couldn't erase. And the Cubans adopted an idea that race itself is subsidiary, right, a byproduct, right, of class society, right? Okay, that's what they thought. Okay, and that's kind of the idea where people who I often caught between people who are just completely class reductionist and race essentialist, right? Race and class are intimately interconnected, in my opinion, right? And race and racial oppression, particularly anti-black racism and white supremacy, are foundational to the international economic order. So in Cuba, they recognized in 1986 that basically, and Fidel Castro gave a speech at the Third Congress of the Communist Party where he said, listen, we haven't eliminated racial discrimination. We must intervene directly. And so in '86, they launched an affirmative action program, which has been deepened and reaffirmed over the previous years. But in the midst of all of this, the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba went into deep economic crisis, right? And so there's a battle and a huge discourse in Cuba on racial inequality. Materially, there's also a discussion on basically the issue ideologically and superstructurally, how black people are perceived, right? In terms of what are beauty standards, right? Okay, and in fact, increasingly now they're acknowledging that when they talk about, if anybody reads Cuban history or even reads the discourse that comes out of Cuba, particularly from the leadership circles, when they talked about the roots of Cuba's revolutionary ideas, they spoke about people like Jose Marti and a number of other people. Now they're increasingly looking at the slave rebellions that took place, people like Carlotta and other people as well, right? So there's a huge debate going on in Cuba, a huge debate. People like Pedro Perez Dewey, Esteban Morales, who's written a lot on this. I myself has intervened and other people have spoken about this as well. There's a huge debate. There's a special commission in the government and the Communist Party to deal with racial discrimination and how these things are represented. But it demonstrates how powerful and international these structures of anti-black racism and white supremacy are, right? So in Cuba, you have this huge debate. You still have representations of black folk that I find completely offensive, because that's how deeply these ideas have penetrated not only people who we might consider European, but even people we consider black. And in the rest of Latin America, like in places like Argentina and Chile, which had a whitening policy, they wanted to bring more white Europeans in to eliminate what they consider to be the black indigenous elements. There's a denial of black history and a denial of black folk. So what's interesting is I'm supposed to be taking I'm taking all depending on the pandemic, a study tour to Colombia. I'm going to Cuba hopefully at the end of April, early May for further research. But I'm taking a study tour of some students to Colombia, right, where we're going to be looking at Afro-Colombian history and resistance, right? Okay, and of indigenous history as well. And in people like Latin America, we have the history of the Colombos and the Palenques, right? So in Brazil, if I can come back to, which are like maroon societies, they're places of resistance to colonialism. If we come back to Brazil, it surprises me how little people speak about Os Palmares, which was like an independent black republic that lasted from the early 1600s until it was crushed in 1695 with great violence, right? This is an example of an independent polity, and it's an example of the fecundity and richness of black political thinking, right? That you can establish an independent state like that. So I know I'm not answering the question that well, but I think Latin America still has a long way to come to terms with its anti-black racism, both economically, in terms of economically, socially, politically, and ideologically, and I would argue spiritually as well.
Thanks, Isaac. And thanks for that question. Excellent question. Adrian asks, in the presentation, you mentioned a few times that enslaved Africans had agency in instigating and ultimately winning their own freedom by pushing against colonial understandings and creating their own space where they could exist with humanity. In today's time, where we are still seeing disparities in black success and access, and we continue to see black people marginalized and devalued in workplaces, how do you propose we create and maintain these spaces today? So I guess spaces where we exercise agency and resistance and advocacy.
Yeah, and that's a question. I wish I had an adequate answer to that. I was reading something recently by David Austin. David Austin is a Canadian scholar of Jamaican origin, based in Montreal, who's written a very important book called Fear of a Black Nation, right? Okay, and he's also written a book on, people may not realize this, but the largest gathering of black revolutionaries, revolutionary and radical thinkers in North America took place in October of 1968 in Montreal. It's called the Black Writers Congress, right? And within this, it was the idea at that point, people were thinking of independent black organizations, creating a space, right? Okay, in which, black people could debate, right? Okay, free of state interference and so forth, ideas of what did black liberation and emancipation mean. And that was, and when you read about the 60s, there's this euphoria. There's this belief that the revolutionary imagination is unfettered. People believe they're going to create a new world, right? At the same time that they believe they're going to create a new world, however feasible and realistic that was, they believed it, right? And it was on the horizon. The ruling circles, the ruling elites, believed that their world of status and privilege and power was under threat. And so you have a significant amount of repression. And some of the repression, destroys these black organizations. But what's also more insidious is they also begin to fund some of them, right? They co-opt people and so on, right? So we're living in the post-George Floyd moment. Sometimes I think we're entering the post-George Floyd fatigue moment, where people are now, like they've said, we've given you black folk, enough cosmetic and performative, symbolic gestures. Now, you want substance. Now, you're going a little too far, but we can chat about that. Okay, but in that post-George Floyd moment, you had organizations involved, and even with Black Lives Matter, and we see the controversy where corporations have stepped in and funded these organizations. So one of the things I think it's important is to create organizations that remain independent, right? That remain tied to the community, right? And that's easier said than done. The history of the 20th century, particularly in the Americas and particularly in North America, is replete of black organizations that were co-opted, or individuals who were co-opted. We had a National Black Coalition in Canada that was co-opted by the state. In my province of Nova Scotia, we had the Black United Front founded that came out of a meeting on November 30th, 1968, the largest black political gathering to that moment in Canadian history. And founded coming out of the visit of 8 Black Panthers to Nova Scotia, under the guidance of Rocky Jones, had this mass democratic meeting, talks about Black self-determination, Black independence, and so forth. And then the federal government and the provincial government, particularly the federal government, fearing that suddenly you have this Black radical ideas coming in Nova Scotia, decide, well, we're not going to repress them. What we're going to do is we're going to throw money at them, and we'll be able to co-op individuals. And then an organization goes from being a place of independent conceptualization and praxis for Black emancipation to simply being a limited developer of very limited social programs for the Canadian government. That's the big issue, right? How do we maintain independence and keep these organizations rooted? It's a problem that's emerged for Black Lives Matter and so forth, right? And I think what I think the issue really is is how do we connect these struggles in the Black community to broader struggles, right? We live too much in a single issue moment, right? And we also live in a time when things get, I call it the neoliberalization of the struggle against oppression, where the stories become so individualized, right? Okay, and we become so single issue. We need to connect these struggles, but we also need not to see the marginalization of Black issues. I know this is not a satisfactory answer, okay, but this is, I think, the problem we face. And I've seen it too often, and I've seen it here in Nova Scotia, when the wake of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and so forth, we have these wonderful explosions of spaces, and then suddenly funding is available, and you have this mad dash, and suddenly that that genuine emancipatory drive is now diverted simply into safe channels that the state can corral and control. So I think we have to solve that particular problem, and it will be solved only through a mass movement that interconnects all of these struggles against the various oppressions and exploitations.
Thanks. I think that's actually a good answer. And a great question, Adrian. One last question. You've been with us, for a long time, close to 2.5 hours now. Leela asks, in the case of Haiti, can you share, the legacy of the Haitian Revolution, its success, its role, its vitality, in the context of Black liberation? I've been thinking about this recently too, and wrote a 2-page story, with some thoughts. But what's Haiti's legacy in terms of Black liberation globally?
Yeah, no, that's a very powerful question. C.L.R. James wrote The Black Jacobins. There's a very important book by Laurent Dubois called Avengers of the West. Haiti's legacy is clearly the challenging of the racial hierarchy that Europeans have. That's one of the legacies. The idea that Black people could not win, could not defeat the Europeans, and could not construct a society. I mean, yes, we can talk about what unfolded afterwards. We can debate whether Toussaint Louverture had different things he could have done, right? Okay, and so on. But the fact that they were able to defeat the Europeans and establish the emancipatory space, and that the only way that this emancipatory space is promised was, shall we say, frustrated, was by a profound cordon sanitaire by European powers, right? The legacy lives on. There's a very famous calypso by David Rudder, who was a Trinidadian calypsonian, called Haiti. And he says, Haiti, I'm sorry, we misunderstood you. One day we'll restore your glory. So it's by recovering and sharing the fact that here were Africans who were in one of the most exploitative societies, no oppressive societies ever. They were able to, despite that, to organize. That's what they did. They organized, and people tend to forget. And I had a picture here, which I didn't get to in my PowerPoint, of Boys Cayman when they come together in this mass democratic meeting. I mean, that in these conditions of oppression, they were able to discuss, to consult, and to have a mass democratic consultation that eventually led to them having the Haitian Revolution, and then basically expanding the ideas beyond just simply Africans to everybody. They abolished slavery, and they were the first ones to establish citizenship on the basis that you were not on the basis of property, but on the basis of you being a human being. And then, of course, the European powers stepped in to crush it, right? Okay, so I think we can reclaim that. Africans can win, they can establish their own polity, and they, as I said before, have their own thought material, right? Their own intellectual and philosophical traditions that can inform a genuinely emancipatory agenda, right? And I think that's one of the things I like to stress. And I talk about the contradictions and the challenges they faced. But many of those contradictions and challenges were the fact that they were born under siege. They were not given the space. Okay?
Right. Yeah. And I think that's often misunderstood. I think people have judged Haiti based on, events of the last, 150 years, and I think have ignored, the achievement. I mean, that constitution, Isaac, right? Which, pretty much, made it clear that, slavery was a crime against humanity, and I think was groundbreaking, right? The thing I was telling you about, I started writing something the other day was, I learned this story of, and this was 1813 or so, and we talk about refugees today and all of that, and back in 1813 or something, a Jamaican slave owner docked his boat in Port Royal, and he went off to go do the paperwork. He had 15 of his slaves on the ship, and they sailed away with it and ended up in Haiti. Sailed to Haiti, right, where they automatically became citizens of Haiti and free men.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, it's astonishing. I mean, like, Haiti, for example, offering assistance to Simon Bolivar, right? Okay.
Exactly.
This broad conception of freedom. Haiti was a beacon of freedom to enslaved Africans, but to other people struggling against colonialism. But also, when you talk about Jamaica, we should also mention the Sham Sharp Rebellion of 1831 to 1832. It's that rebellion, okay, even though it ultimately failed, that accelerated the end of slavery in the British Empire. Okay, as Eric Williams said, the Africans saying emancipation now, right? Not tomorrow. And the British were frightened that Africans would emancipate themselves on their own on their own terms, which would end colonialism and so forth. I'm sort of reminded, as David Austin likes to say, when you think of these rebellions, it's almost like a public exorcism, right? And releasing of all these centuries of pent-up anger and anxiety and frustration, right? To eliminate these demons of oppression and exploitation from slavery and from colonialism, right? That had basically invested in and infested their minds and their bodies, right? So these things become festivals, rehearsals, right? Okay. Of people's liberations, right? Okay, in that sense.
Isaac, my brother, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was outstanding, and I want to thank the audience for coming and participating, and for the great questions. And this was really enlightening. I want to just let everybody know you're actually coming back to talk to us. You're coming to speak with our working group that's involved with the hiring initiative of 12 Black scholars. So Isaac's coming back to share his experiences at Dalhousie, and hopefully we'll be able to get some lessons out of that. But this was outstanding. I want to thank you so much. I want to remind the audience that tomorrow we wrap up EDI week with a symposium on the book A Fluid Frontier, Slavery Resistance, the Underground Railroad, and the Detroit River region, with a host of special guests, and the editor of the book, and a number of contributors. So thanks, everybody. I hope you're able to make that event tomorrow morning. And Isaac, we will be in touch. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. Thank you so much.
I owe you thanks. Thank you so much, and everybody have a great weekend and a great rest of 2022.
Thank you so much.